Aloha, everyone, and welcome to another episode of From Anxiety to Clarity. I'm Beth-Ann Kozlovich from Sutter Health Kahi Mohala, and this project has been an ongoing labor of love, both from Kahi Mohala and my colleague Trisha Kajimura and the Leong family in Brain Gain, Hawaii. So with that, we're going to take a look at where we are now as we're in the first part of October. We've entered a very warm October, no wind, very, very, very hot for most of the islands. Got a little bit of shower, which only brought on more humidity, which seemed to intensify a lot of the feelings that many of us are having about where we are at this stage of the year with COVID-19. So where are we? Well, we're a little less than 2 weeks away from opening the state to travelers with a pre-travel protocol. And we're going to see how that's going to go. We've talked about that at length, so we won't go out into that here. Oahu has been opening up. There's still a great deal of reticence to be out and about. I was at Ala Moana for a very quick trip a couple of days ago, and it was a virtual ghost town. So not necessarily what any of us are used to seeing. And many people's lives have gotten a lot smaller in the last 7-8 months or so that they've been told to be careful or to be inside or to stay at home. And it's gotten a little more difficult for people, I think, to be out and about and feel like they have a sense of normalcy with the back and forths that we've gone through with the stay-at-home orders and the partial opening up, and you can do this, but you can't do that. Very confusing for a lot of people. And at the base of this is the whole healthcare discussion of COVID-19, what it means for us psychologically and what it means for us physically. Today, we're going to take a look at that through the lens of Native Hawaiian health and well-being. And we have one of the best people in the state to do that. Sheri Daniels joins us from Papaʻolalokahi on Maui. And I'm so glad to be able to talk with you again, Sheri.
Yes, myself too. Thank you, Beth-Ann, and good morning to everyone. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be joining you and just having conversations. It's kind of like that Saturday morning. On Maui now, our Sunday paper is now the Saturday paper. So, it's kind of like, let's talk story. Let's just kind of just see what's going on with each other and what's happening around the state.
We really meant this project to be that kind of touchstone, looking at COVID through the lens of mental health, especially obviously with the connections and the sponsorship of Sutter Health Kahi Mohala, and our interest in the fact that we haven't had a lot of parity of mental health with physical health, and COVID-19, for better and certainly for worse, has been able to spotlight what those needs are throughout our community, and looking at it through our sub-communities too, but especially looking at what you have been seeing in the Native Hawaiian community and a lot of the issues that were pre-existing to COVID that now have been in some ways highlighted by COVID. How would you characterize those?
I think you hit it right on the nose, Beth-Ann, that I don't think anyone is in disagreement that our community has faced quite a lot of health disparities over the years, over the decades, and we continue to. But I think what COVID is creating for our community is this even more so, the reality of how we intersect everything with our everyday lives. And I think everyone is doing that regardless of what community you're from. But I think for Native Hawaiians, there's so many layers on top of layers when we talk about when you're already challenged to begin with, to add things that really, like you said, highlights, but also I think points out the obvious, and there's nowhere to go but to take a look at it. It's really hard because that's not what we've been, I think, allowed to do or taught to do, right? It's we do all these other things instead of what we need to focus on the root cause. Not to say that not a lot of work has been done in this area, especially around mental health. I think even in the last 30 years, our communities have become much more aware, more insightful around what that means. We know our community has a really high number of suicides mental health, whether it's also coupled with substance abuse and other chronic these conditions, all of that plays in. But I think COVID's added another layer that now starts to really include the economics, the housing, all these other social supports, not to mention as a community and as a culture, the need for connection, the need of how we connect. All of those things are not norms. So it's not like we shifted in one area, but we still have all these others that we can manage with. Everything has been shifting. Everything is different. I think we all can agree to that. And so when we talk about how we manage mental health in our community, it's one thing when it's one or two issues, right? That, okay, we're going to walk through this. When it's like 5, 10, maybe more, and it's not just a small pocket, it there is no getting out of this. Everyone has been touched by this, right? Everyone, whether you still have your job but you're working from home, whether um, your kids are now at home in school, maybe you're also now taking care of an older adult. You know, all of us have been touched by it, right? We see it. You mentioned Ala Moana. I mean, um, even here on Maui, you drive around and it's very surreal. I feel sometimes like I'm almost back 30 years, 40 years, where there were less cars, less people. But you wonder like how are people managing? And I think I always ask that, yeah, ooh, how are people managing? How are people finding those opportunities? And I feel very weird saying this, but self-care. I mean, we hear it, we've heard it with September being Suicide Prevention Month, right? We've heard a lot of um, PSAs around talk to somebody, you know, find a friend, share what's going on, because we recognize that that is a legitimate concern with COVID. Um, but it's almost this guiltiness of saying, I know, Beth, I'm going to call you and let's talk story. I'm kind of having a hard day. And it doesn't it doesn't help, like you said, that it's so humid, right? It's so humid. So
It's insult really to injury
I
on so
know.
many levels, and we can laugh about it. It's almost dark humor with it, but it just as that rises and everyone is feeling so much that it just seems to be the external emblem of how many people are feeling with so many of the issues that you just raised. But I want to talk to you about some of those because there's a lot there to unpack with what you've said initially. I mean, the idea of how connection looks within the Native Hawaiian community as opposed to how connection looks outside of it. Very, very different. And if you can talk a little bit about, I'd like to talk with you about what's been lost, because it seems like there has been something fundamentally, removed from the picture to maintain the health and well-being of people physically, but that it's really demoralized the mental health of the Native Hawaiian community in a very different way, although allied to what the rest of us may be feeling, but something that the rest of us may not be engaged with in the way that Native Hawaiians have been. How do you see that?
Well, and I think you bring up a really interesting intersection, because I don't think it's just Native Hawaiians. I think it's Pacific Islanders kind of in general. And on top of that, the additional layer is local culture, local in the way we exist, the way we kind of
living in community in a very, very different way. Yeah.
In a very different way where, you're much more aware of what's happening with your neighbors. You're much more in tuned or, wanting to be not so individualistic, but communal. And I think that's really the big part of a lot of Pacific Islander, Polynesian, Native Hawaiian communities is we're very communal, right? But that's Hawaii too, right? We're all used to going to graduations, weddings, baby luau's, and so and even funerals, right? And so how do we do those functioning things that are respectful and we want to do, and we want to celebrate these great things or mourn something that is important to us, but do it in a way that's safe? And I think several communities, including Native Hawaiians, have really really looked at those events and how we can still celebrate, but celebrate it in a way that keeps the rest of the community safe. There's been campaigns around, masking up, making sure we watch out for our kupuna, right? That it's not about us. It's about the actions we take influence and impact the greater community. And I think at the end of the day, that is the core of Native Hawaiian communities and Pacific Islander communities, is we come together to support and uplift, and never making it about this individualistic piece. But unfortunately, COVID puts us in that kind of space, right? Because we're to isolate, we're to kind of restrict our movements, we're encouraged to wear a mask. Where, I mean, I'm not sure about you, Beth-Ann, but I really have a hard time gauging people's reactions when they have a mask on. And so, in that social cues kind of thing, how are people doing that, right? Because you see a part of somebody's whole face, and in our community, that nonverbal, you pick up a lot of that. So, I don't know about you, but I'm always, it's like I feel like I have to lean in a little closer, but then you don't want to, because it's like, oh, wait, 6 feet, 6 feet of physical distance. And I think that's really a challenge.
And I think it's especially a challenge for people who are used to being in very close proximity to each other's faces. I mean, sharing breath, being able to experience someone in a very close way, which is not necessarily the way other people may behave external to the Native Hawaiian or, Pacific Island communities. It's a very different way of being, and a different way of associating oneself within community. And although I see a lot of people who made adjustments to attend weddings and or funerals, baby luau's, going to celebrate graduations. I mean, people have gotten very creative around all that.
Yes.
But it's very different, I think, within the Native Hawaiian community, because of the way in which generationally people have lived. And so it's so deeply rooted, it's so deeply felt, that it's more than just a sudden thing of oh, I'm isolating, and this doesn't feel good, and how do we celebrate this, or how do we do that? Right. It seems like there's just a much greater depth to it. And I don't mean to be projecting, but it just seems, looking at it generationally and how people behaved and what they did together and the way in which they did that together, it seems like there's just much more there that may feel the impact of a COVID isolation. And well, so and how are people coping with that?
I think you're right. I think people, I don't think anybody, we never anticipated the length that this would take, right? So, it's not just, okay, let's try to, do these things. But now we're at the stage where, okay, how is our life going to look different? Mm-hmm. And how are we going to figure out, on top of whatever pile of other things we've got going on, that we can still have this connection to family, friends, our community. I think that is a challenge, because when you're used to even, going to your family's house for the weekend, to the beach, to those kinds of things that are really opportunities to have fun, have kind of that, to decompress, even that becomes a stressful event. And so I don't think at this stage we really know what the impacts are. I think there's a lot of, we kind of see it. We know that mental health, we know that the increase of some of those other social components, the domestic violence, the increased stress, all of those things we are going to anticipate is going to go up, just right. From, even if you look at and I don't want to say healthy or family, because I do believe everyone has these moments of stuff, stress, things, right? But in the best scenario, You have a family who has the means, they have the mechanisms, maybe they have the space for their kids to have, school. Mom and dad are able to still have a job, but remotely. Even just that stresses, right? A family or a person is not able to delineate opportunities for breaks. How do we create those very intentional pockets? And in before COVID, people struggled, right? But you kind of managed. You could manage. This really has thrown a loop for it. And I don't really believe we have a really clear grasp on what that's going to kind of project out, and even in the next several months. I think we're
I don't
going to
think
see
anybody does, Sheri.
no.
Honestly, I mean, the truth of the matter is that within the mental health community, as you know, we're all expecting that there's going to be this mental health wave, and how long we may see the effects of COVID-19, and certainly on children with social and emotional learning, and the fact that we may see kids who kind of move into two different directions. One group that may be highly resilient, and another group that may fall greatly behind and may feel greater impacts than their peers, just the way in which children may be able to react to all this. We don't know a
Right.
lot of that yet, and we may not know that for quite some time, and that's going to be for everybody. But the
Yeah.
way in which that sifts into the Native Hawaiian community may look very, very different, because we already know that there are certain issues with health equity, as well as learning, as well as there's places within the community where the Native Hawaiian community isn't necessarily fully engaged out of choice, or maybe not out of choice, but certainly dealing with that piece of health equity, both mental and physical health. That I think is going to be a big one that we're going to have to wrestle with in a way that maybe we only gave it some lip service in the past.
Yep. And you're right. And I think what I think we'll also see is the resilience of a community. And when we look back, the health inequities and the disparities, and I think we tend to look at that because somehow, somewhere, we've believed that ties into resources, right? That ties into getting things. But I do want to kind of just mention that a lot of these communities that have had challenges, that continue to struggle and have challenges, have levels of resiliency too. And I think that may be that untapped key that what will that be? How will that look like? Because I think you're right that, for the Native Hawaiian community, all these other things will continue to grow, right? All these new pieces is going to layer on it. I just wonder if it won't become the easy, like, a scapegoat of it was COVID. Because of COVID, right? All of these things. Because of COVID. Well, I don't think it's because of COVID. I think let's be real and look at that. These things existed before COVID.
So how do you get them to stop scapegoating that? I mean, are you already making plans? I mean, not only as an organization, but just as a concerned citizen and a very active voice within the Native Hawaiian community. How do you make sure then that it isn't scapegoated, so that people just sort of lump it into the one basket of, well, it happened because of the pandemic, as opposed to the failure of society to look at some very real issues that's people were tracking, certain people were tracking, but they weren't getting a broad hearing within the greater community to be able to truly fix it, and to see that resources were appropriated in certain ways that would have made a difference and set up the Native Hawaiian community to better cope with COVID or anything else that may come down the line.
Well, I think you're right. Yes, Native Hawaiians, but I think when we look at vulnerable, under marginalized communities in general, and we're not saying just because of the numbers but if we look from that lens, I think we see utilization or request of resources or pulling into resources, right, based on those underrepresented communities, using it to support the greater community good, which is great. But really looking at the root of the issue. I think when we kind of, if we really have a honest look back and, you know, of resources, of services, of support, I think there were efforts to try to improve, you know, health disparities in Native Hawaiians and in other communities. But when the resources are very small to do big things, you only can do so much, right? And they don't get addressed. So it's kind of like then that just continues, and then the new issues get layered on top of it. And so I think from a community standpoint, there's also the part of, I think many in our Native Hawaiian communities are starting to ask questions about the like bigger issues. Health is a really large issue. Mental health is part of that. But there's also the piece about economics, right? Because we all have to live and survive. Health is part of that cycle. Health is also part of the cycle of education and how we offer those kinds of opportunities to our community. And so when we look at a social determinants of health model, you know, I wonder sometimes when we say our state is the healthiest or the happiest, what are we really looking at? Because if I looked at a social determinants of health model, that is not what I'm seeing across all communities. And so, you know, I understand why we say that. I get it, but you know, we got to really look at the data and look at the data in a disaggregated fashion so we can really be honest. I think somehow we think that if we're not honest, we won't get resources, or maybe we don't show that we've done work. But I tend to disagree. I believe when we really are honest, the good and the bad, we can that's actually opportunities to do better. And I think there's ways that we can be used as a model so that we can see what is the range of resources, services, programming that can be made available, right? So it's not the one size fit all, because we recognize in many communities, even geographic communities, what works in Waianae will not probably work down in Ka'u, right? Maybe some of it will, not all of it. And we tend to just create, you know, cookie cutters for that. Although I do have to say, there are attempts to give us a range of cookie cutters. It's just, we cannot all use circles. Some of us need squares and rectangles and triangles, or something very different. So I think, you know, the circle was what we had for many, many years. And then they you know, folks decided, well, let's give them some options. Let's give options to communities. We're going to give them, you know, 4 different sizes of the circle cookie cutters. And now I think we're starting to say, yeah, no. But I think one of the barriers of reality is the resources that's tied to that. Because if the numbers aren't large enough, if the community isn't vocal enough,
then it gets marginalized.
Right. And then it becomes, well, they didn't say anything. They, you know, they never brought it up. The challenge is that these communities that are marginalized are just trying to survive. They are just trying to survive and live. And these policies, these larger, bigger pictures are so far off of their radar. It's not that it's not important to them, but what's important is the right now, the moment now, and maybe in the next 2 or 3 months, right?
So let's stop there for just a moment, because I know you've said a great deal about how resources have been appropriated, who's getting them, who's not getting them, the fact that it's not one size fits all, or even just a couple of options that don't fit everyone, that we really have to look at it at a much more granular level. I hate to use that term, but really getting into the bones of it and seeing the differences of communities and what they really need, and how to create mechanisms so that those voices can better be heard when everybody wants to sort of aggregate things so they can be done in a lump sum. So what is it that you think, particularly as we're still dealing with COVID and are going to be dealing with that for a long time, what do you think is going to be the difference in making this time a time of real change in the way that marginalized communities and those who are greatly at risk, be they Native Hawaiian or not, are going to be viewed going forward, or at least be able to get greater resource help in a meaningful way, not just, money or a program or this, but something that really is going to work better. How do we better integrate that knowledge so that you have those better choices?
You know, it's interesting that you mentioned that. I mean, I think in the last several days, we've all seen things on the news around the restaurant cards, the this, the, all of things. And I think when you really look at people's comments and what people are feeling, a lot of it is about choice. A lot of it is about transparency, optics, all of those things. I do think people are becoming much more, even as oppressive as it feels many of the times. I do believe communities and people are starting to just kind of pay more attention to things. And so I do really strongly believe in transparency. I also believe no two communities are alike. They might have similar traits. They might have very in alignment needs. And it goes back to, at the end of the day, Native Hawaiians, yes, this is our land, this is all of that, but we were never an exclusive or excluding others. We've never been that community in any
Far
way.
from it. Far
Right.
from it.
And so I do also believe that we have to, one, within our Native Hawaiian community, which there are many, many opportunities and ways that we've been doing this, is to have safe space, to have conversations, right? To empower ourselves to have those voices, but to recognize that, Native Hawaiians have opinions. They're very intellectual, and there are going to be differencing of opinions in any community, right? But I think it's also not using those differences of opinions in a community to create divisiveness. We have to recognize that we're not going to be all 100% in agreement on the pathway in which we have to take something. I think we will be in agreement on that end goal. And I think that's the challenge, is how do we reprogram, reshift the machine? And I say the machine as really the funders, the policymakers, whoever is that we recognize as being responsible for the societal things that are happening, right? How do we help them recognize that the way that the game and the system has operated may not have been the best suited? It's not going to help everyone in the same way that you want, and that there's going to have to be some adjustments, some tweaking here and there, if we all agree on the same end goal. But we get so stuck in the pathway to get there that we lose sight of it after a while, right? Because what happens is divisiveness comes in, this almost like, well, why do they, not us, all of that. And then we start fighting over the resources, and the resources may not be large. And so it sets up this sense of behavior of us and them, and it shouldn't be. It should never be that way. And so
give me an example of that, of where you think that could be changed. I mean, is there something in your mind that you've been thinking about for a while, in the way that we talk about the way divided resources can happen in a positive way, and in which various communities can be honored without having the divisiveness come into it, where we've seen, everything from, what happens, everywhere from, up on the mountain to any other place, just
right,
how that is going on, that's dividing people in ways that are unfortunate and unhealthy. I mean, people have differing opinions, and that's fine, but the way in which this divisiveness has been driven in seems to be all the more a reason to step back and try to find a reason to create a better way to talk about it, to have a better way of being able to divide resources and to honor. And I'm wondering if you have any sort of, I don't know, a prototype or a sample in your mind of, if let's just try it on this, and if it works here, maybe it'll work over here. If there's a way of showing exactly what you're talking about.
Well, and I don't want to give two examples. I think one, we definitely, for those who've been tracking the whole contact tracing, communities, we recognize, um, even from a systems perspective, they know what the heck is going on, especially in smaller communities, right? I mean, Native Hawaiians is a larger, but as we start breaking it down, somebody here on Maui will be much more in tune in what's happening on Maui, right? So how do we start linking them to, okay, what's the voice larger? What are the voices around those different islands, and having those mechanisms, but really understanding that communities, those trusted individuals within communities, really hold a key to a lot of things, right? And so when this kind of happened, there was we saw it surging in some of our Pacific Islander communities, and really, the conversation was, let's get why are those communities not at the table? And I think, we've moved from we want a seat at the table to um, no, we want to have meaningful conversations at the table that create meaningful outcomes, right? So why are we not going right to the sources? And what happens is, the mechanisms are set up, but it's not nimble and it's not flexible. So if a community says, yes, this is what we need, this is how we can do it, this would work, the mechanism that provides, if there are resources, can't, because that's not the way it was established. And so I think over time, and over time meaning in a very quick way, to start to figure out, like, well, these communities are going to try to figure it out on their own. And what happens is you're going to have some of that machine shift the best they can. But what's going to happen is a large part of that machine isn't, which to me, that's where the concern comes back, because when we kind of get over the hump of this, will the departments, the agencies, those mechanisms continue to shift in this change, or will they revert back to what they're comfortable with and what the status quo is? So I do see, when we look at these, the surges in the Pacific Islander communities, they said we need translators, we need people to help our community understand the process, because if they don't understand it, there's fear and there's uncertainty, there's confusion, and there was news stories about that, I think, the last couple nights, right? So that is definitely, but I do have to say, where it's changed is the fact that the Department of Health is recognizing the need to do that now. That's
And
different than saying they've done, I mean, like, they're going to do a great job.
right,
The fact that they're trying, we got to give them that.
right. Yeah, and just on that point, because I think that's the one that many of us, and certainly this turned up in the news when it was happening last month, and we realized that although Pacific Islanders may be 4% of the population, it was well over 32% of the cases that we were seeing during the surge. And the point that many people seem to come to after seeing that is, well, why didn't we approach them in a different way? Why didn't we have it translated so that people could understand and not just see everybody else running around trying to make something happen, but what that something was a little vague and unknown and scary. And if we had had that sort of that ability to do this in advance, this sort of, instead of the pound of cure,
Right.
that it seemed that it took,
Yeah.
to have just a little bit more forethought about it and a little bit better planning and real recognition that there are micro communities that need to have that delivered in a different way. I think your point is that, will we be able to leverage this kind of learning into future situations where we're not dealing, hopefully, with a pandemic, but we're dealing with what our community writ large as well as sub-communities need, and how those two things interact with each other.
Right. And I agree. And I think
Is that
one
it?
of, I think, yes. And I do want to say, Beth-Ann, that a lot of it too is the system, the departments, right? The government, they're looking at the larger public health, right? That's their kind of thing is, well, we're looking at the bigger community, and to single out a community could create, device, could create almost this unintended effect, right? We don't want to stigmatize them. We don't want to do those things. But I think when we step back and we go, okay, so what are the factors? The factors didn't change because of COVID. The factors were already there, and the factors had to do with socioeconomics, a large driver. The factors was we live in a multi-linguistical community and cultural community. So why weren't those things already part of the packaging that happens in other services, right? Because they are a part of the community. All of us are. So I think it's raised from a very different social perspective. It's raised a question around equity in terms of cultural equity, right? When we look over the last year or two prior to COVID, we've seen blips of especially the Native Hawaiian community really pushing back on things around language access in the criminal justice arena, right? With the judiciary. We've been looking at the Mauna. There's water resources. All of those things were active well before COVID came into the picture. So then it makes one think like, why were those things not done then? Well, so that I think is where hopefully, if as we move forward, the departments, the government really start taking an honest look around, okay, we did the knee jerk, we got through this. Now, how can we be preventative in a sense, right? How do we take the preventive measures to be proactive, to start having these conversations that we're going to have to start moving the dial in a different way? I think we got to move away from being culturally competent, doing, saying those wonderful words, but actually demonstrating that in the behaviors of the departments, of how resources are allocated, but even beyond that, how they operate and how they engage. I think that's the big $1 million question that I think, in our community, it's this, show me, don't tell me, right? You don't just come and ask, how can I help you? How can I do this? But more of, let me just get in there and help you.
I'm laughing only because I had the same thing running through my head. It's got to be show me, don't tell me. And then it came out of your mouth. That always has more power to it than simply telling somebody what they should do and how they should do it. Show them. And we say that, about teaching somebody how to fish as opposed to just giving them fish. We've had a lot of those parables given to us as children. But this idea of being preventative and really trying to look into the future, we've heard for decades a lot of pretty words about that. But then we've seen the phrase kick the can down the road come at us so many times that people are almost inured to it, or they figure that, well, that's what's going to happen anyway. Do you really think that, given the government structure that we have and the way in which the departments are learning to operate now, because heaven knows we've seen a lot of turnover in government departments just through the last couple of months of COVID, that this will be a lasting effect in teaching us to move from a very reactionary perspective to one of more of prevention?
Oh, if I had the crystal ball, I could cure so many things.
Couldn't we all? Couldn't we all?
I think kind of like, when we talk about the threat of mental health and feeling just so heavy, so right, where do we navigate? Where do we fix? What do we fix first? And not even fix, but what do we address first? How do we, create those opportunities? And even if we look at it from that way, it's overwhelming, right? I mean, to just imagine the undertaking that would need to happen, huge. And then I think, well, part of, okay, so they say a a culture, peoples can be disseminated in, I think they say like, say a generation, right? But to rebuild, it's going to take that much more long plus some to get it. Let's look at our native Hawaiian language, or any natives or indigenous communities and those that struggle with language. Look how quickly that was snuffed out and how long it has taken us to get to this point, which is there's still tons more to go. So when I look at your question of, do I think it's changes on the horizon? I want to believe that. I really do. I mean, maybe that's holding on to hope, but that would mean that, and I don't want to be disrespectful in any way, but I think that those that have been in those seats or in those systems for an extended period of time and who've been raised in that system, it's really hard to see that there's another way. It's really hard to change and be innovative. I think we use all these wonderful, fluffy, pretty words of innovation and partnerships and that. And no, we're a team. So for me, and I just got to share this because I think there's layers of what that means to be a true partner. And you're not just a partner. You start off as teamwork. We might work together. We know each other. Beth-Ann, you and I met each other. We have conversations. We see that we have some similar thinking. Maybe we don't always agree on things, but we know what we can do to make things work. I know what I can call you on. You know what you can call me on. Things like that. And then the years go by. We have some success, maybe some failures in projects, but we can have some real conversations. I can tell you, like, Beth-Ann, I really don't think that is going to be useful for us. I don't think it's meaningful. And we can have those hard conversations, right? It's like we're dating. We're dating. And partnership means, and I've said this in other talks, is when we're walking down the aisle. We're buying a house. Right. Maybe not even walking down the aisle because people can choose to not, but we've invested way more to separate from things that we work on. It's going to be a little bit more hard. It's going to take more. It's going to hurt. I'm going to grieve. There's a partnership. Ending of a partnership means that in some way I'm going to mourn that. When you think, let's just think about this. Do we truly have true partnerships in many of these situations? No. We're teamwork. We're getting funds. We're doing XYZ to get to get the dollars. That's a teamwork. We might collaborate because we have years. We've been doing this for 20 years. But maybe, and that might be okay. But maybe my partnership is when I turn around and I have the community in which I serve, whether it's the community of Papakolea in homesteads, whether the community is kupuna that reside in a nursing home, whether community is my zip code, right? Or my halal. That is the partnership piece, because that is what is going to have the change. That's where the values and the meaningfulness comes from. I would love to see, if I turn to where the funding and the resources come from, that those become partnerships. But that's a big ask, because the big piece of partnership is trust. And if I can't trust you, how am I going to trust that you're not going to mess my community up? Right?
Because there's also another element in there of control, because when you have partnership, there is usually dual control, or at least some real import.
Right.
Well, someone feels that they can
I have
make.
to dance. Well, I have to dance with you in a partnership.
Right.
And you might, in a partnership, I'm going to trust that you might, Beth-Ann, you might have the bag of coins, of gold coins, that's going to pay for all this stuff. But we're going to know that maybe right now you're going to hold it, but my value and my resource comes with the people, right? So you're not going to use that bag of coins and jingle it up front of me to say, okay, now jump through the hoops. It's going to be, I have this, Sheri, so what can we do with it together? because I don't know, but I know of my gold coins, I got to take some of it because I have my own overhead. But this is what we got. What can we do with it? Right. So I think that's going to be, I don't know. I really honestly do not know if the current structure is capable of that big shift in thinking. I think some smaller divisions within these large departments could.
For
But then
example,
again,
within the Department of Health, take that one, for example, because that one's obviously what we're dealing with now with COVID and will be going forward. And plus, issues of health equity that have been long standing have been
right.
very much seated within, obviously, the Department of Health.
So if I take that one, if I just take that one, I'm going to say probably the alcohol and drug abuse division. Now, I'm not saying things are wonderful and roses and sunshine, but I think they have demonstrated in the last several years their ability to really look at cultural programming and what that means, right? What that means in terms of what somebody who's Native Hawaiian comes out with in terms of treatment, how they're integrating cultural anchoring and understanding in the work that they're doing, right? I'm a very strong believer that just because you take a group, to the taro fields to go clean a lo'i, that does not make it a cultural program. But if you tell me that you're helping those participants understand the cycle, where that water comes from, how it's nourishing,
Connection
to all, and then connecting it to your recovery, connecting it to your mental health, connecting it to, right, and living those values. That is way more. And so I think ADAD has really tried, and in some cases been successful in trying to integrate that. But remember, they're small in compared to the conglomerate of what the Department of Health is. So I think that's a really great example. I think another great example is, and this is only for COVID, so it's not across all, they were able to disaggregate the data, right? So somebody can go now and look at their website and they can see that. However, let's just take data then. Is that something that can be done in all divisions of Department of Health? Because they've already started. And what if that's done across all state departments? There is a state law about including and having, this whole understanding of culture, of Native Hawaiian culture values embedded in their dealings. I don't think they really use it, right? It's one of those feel good, check a box, wonderful. And then it comes back to who checks? Where's the accountability, right? Who's checking to see when the departments put out, money asking feds for dollars and they're using Native Hawaiians or Pacific Islanders as their marginalized community, yet they may not have had conversations with those providers that are actually on the ground. I think it's really important for any of our communities to even understand what our lanes are, what lanes we operate in, because I think we're going to really need to. So yeah, we can put a lot of onus on the departments and where the resources come in, but I think in communities we also need to ready ourselves for the change. And that's also meaning understanding what lanes we're in. So if my lane is health, and I know education or housing weaves into my lane, that's great. Then I need to make sure I have relationships with those partners. But I'm not going to go driving in their lane. And it's that whole belief, right? If I'm walking down the street and I see my neighbor has, mangoes on the tree, I'm not going to go stop and pick it. I'm going to go and make hey, auntie, uncle, I see you have mangoes, or I'm going to come and do kind of a reciprocal exchange. But that's the thing, is I think sometimes communities are trying to get those resources as quickly and as, as needed as possible. And they just kind of overstep each other. I don't want to be cryptic in thinking that also is a benefit to those that hold the resources, right? Because that also pays into their power. So I think as communities, we have to recognize our own values and our power and not chase because we think that that's all there's ever going to be. Right. And so it's really changing our thinking and our paradigm. And then let's layer that with what's going on in the world. How do we say that, keep that as our North Star in a way, right? When everything else is bombarding on people, you know, and I shared with you, Beth-Ann, that, you know, yesterday or Thursday was my day to go to the grocery store, right? And walk around aimlessly. And that's my self-care, you know. So how do we do that when there's so many other things that people have as their top priorities? You know, so I think it's figuring out who your support is and almost doing that wrestling thing of, I'm going to tag you, Beth-Ann, because I need a break, right? And that comes with the partnership and the trust too, because then I know you're not going to use that against me for your own benefit. And so I think that's really
and that's
important.
the bottom, and that I think that's the bottom line for all of this as we move through COVID and into whatever comes next, how vaccines will be disseminated, all of that. You and I could probably go on with this for hours and hours, and I know we've gone on for quite a while now. And I want to thank you, and I know we'll have another conversation hopefully soon as we begin to move through this. But now, as we're in this hot October, I hope that there will be some cool thoughts as how we move forward, and to be able to create those real partnerships, not just in you know, name only, or that papers over, or a lot of old stuff, but where we're able to really make some positive change in the health and well-being of the Native Hawaiian community. And that, of course, supports the greater community and everything that Hawaii is and is so attractive to the rest of the world. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Beth-Ann. Thank you so much.
And thank all of you for joining us for another episode of From Anxiety to Clarity. If you have an idea for another conversation, you can let me know. My email is kozlovb@sutterhealth.org. And if you have a question that you have burning, send it to us and we'll make sure that you get an answer if at all possible. We have friends throughout the mental health community. If you have a particular question about that, we'll get you an answer. Otherwise, we will see you next time for another conversation to take us from anxiety to clarity. Aloha.